Good evening. Welcome. Tonight, I think in the last couple of weeks has become a thing. Again, a long-time friend of the school, somebody who has been absolutely essential and integral to what SCI-Arc is today, as somebody who was the director here in the school, who was one of the leaders of moving the school into this building in this part of town. And in many ways, the reason why I'm here. So feel free to insult him about the last one. Neil was the one who hired me here in 2001 for what I always will be grateful for what I learned from him as a leader, as a teacher, as an architect, but also as a friend. So it's always tricky to introduce somebody who I consider part of the family, and Neil has been a crucial part of this family in many, many levels. So I try to see if I can touch on certain subjects, which I think, for at least people in my generation, they are being very obvious, and they were part of the conversation in many ways. But sometimes for people who are younger, sometimes those things get lost or became like ancient history, and actually it's a very recent one. So there was a couple of things I wanted to touch in introducing Neil, and one have to do with what I would consider obsessions or fetishism or very healthy extreme understanding of what everybody does or somebody does, in this case, his own work. And in many, many ways, I would argue that Neil, among very few others, were ahead of his time in trying to understand the value of the power of the image and drawing as an intermediate thing, as a way to rethink a whole territory. Some of this work is before computers or a mixed techniques and so on, but there is also kind of a sense of humor in the whole thing, which I think in the 90s, Neil, like many other important architects, entered into the matrix of what computers and all the things come to the territory. In his case, probably the most extreme for also similarity of color taste. And also I think that's what M stands in his name, Neil M. Denari, I think is for matrix. But nevertheless, what I think was interesting is, unlike other architects, his work was already there before the full understanding of this construction of almost a parallel world that can happen in the way that we thought and we understood architecture. He mentioned at that time, and I don't know if this still is true because his practice has took a different dimension today with a lot of much bigger practice, commissions, and professional work, which I'm not so sure that this still holds. But at one point, Neil mentioned that he didn't have the need to work with physical models because he had the capacity to understand everything in the computer. And for me, that was a crucial moment in my own understanding of what is the value of this. And of course, this book was absolutely crucial in shaping this. One of the reasons I want to mention to this is because sometimes when we revisit some of these moments, we tend to focus, in particular in the work of middle 90s to early 2000s, in the procedure or quasi-technique-driven and quasi-scientific project. But the work of Neil was working with computers in different territory, in which he was really a pioneer in trying to understand the construction of an alternative reality as a way to understand the other reality. So in many ways, one could argue that Neil was Neo. Which it brings me to another issue, which I think is very important, which is the issue what I would call the true search for originality. And we know, all of us who are in the architectural world, that the idea of true originality is almost impossible to achieve in the architectural context, but there are moments and glances that one could say that there are certain before and afters. And the idea at that time of the continuous and the false surface was a really crucial one. And this is a moment that I think it had to do with his obsession through the pursuit of originality. Of course, this idea took many followers, many trying to get involved. And I will say architecture is always a collective construction. So this issue became, in some cases, very bad and very good. But Neil decided to put a stop to that and keep evolving. And his work, there was a moment that this became almost ridiculous. It was very difficult to distinguish who was what. This probably peaked in the Denari 2004. And I think Neil took a different trajectory without abandon all the things that he introduced. And I think it keep pushing that pursuit, and I hope what we'll see tonight is a result of some of those desires to pursue these obsessions, this level which I don't think many architects can be described this way, but I think his architecture is exquisite. It's not just elegant. It's elegant, it's obsessive, but it's exquisite. There is a level of control and a relentless pursuit of originality, even though understanding the limits of that I think it makes him one of the most crucial figures, I would argue, in the last 25 years in our field. So I will ask you to join me to welcome Neil Denari one more time to SCI-Arc.
Thank you, Hernan, and it's always good to be back, and it won't be the last time. It's one more time. And thanks to the students who curated this to allow me to come, and I understand Peter last week. And it's nice to be here. I want to thank also my team who's back at the office toiling away as they always do, and thank them for the work. And also for people who aren't in the office, because the work you're going to see takes years to work on and produce. These are projects I'm showing or have been in the office for 3 and 4 and 5 years now. So that's part of the outrageous aspect of architecture, because I couldn't think of a better word of what architecture was, but through and through, the only thing it is outrageous. It takes, even in its most modest moment, an outrageous amount of money, an outrageous amount of commitment, outrageous amount of luck, outrageous number of miracles. It's only that. It's never anything other than that. And the discipline it takes to practice, the discipline is pretty obvious, but the discipline itself is also outrageous too. It's challenging. You lose more than you win. Batting averages are lower than the worst baseball player, et cetera, et cetera. And so challenges to how to think about your ideas within the context of the discipline, as well as the system, I would say, of architecture, is what I want to talk about tonight. And I got a little preamble, and then we'll get into a number of projects that are all in the office right now, or one that was recently done. And speaking of the matrix, I was almost going to put in a picture of the matrix, because I'm talking about the grid as well as a condition of the project. And I think at some point I would say a lot of the lectures I've given have talked about, let's say, concepts and ideas, but not really about the conditions to play them out. And I guess that there's a certain point where every architect needs to talk about the conditions that place ideas in a context, and I think that time has come for me, and that's sort of what this talk is about tonight. So the grid represents the field in which we work as architects in terms of the normative, and for Superstudio, of course, it was a moment where the concept of it as both an ironist point of view about territory, which was synonymous with their kind of landscape projects and connected to slightly earlier projects like No Stop City, and the humor of, let's say, taking the grid and making clothing and a furniture line to commodify it, to turn it into a kind of curious, weird relationship to the market, was one moment, in Italian kind of speculative architecture where resistance and capitulation, or resistance and agreement, was all one and the same. And it, for me, is it's an interesting point to start from. A few years earlier, of course, Virilio and Perron and the project of the oblique was about killing the X and the Y and only producing the idea that there's something in between, and itself a kind of metaphysical critique of the world that we live in, and producing a challenge to the upright body, to the horizon line, to the street, to the facade, to the street wall, et cetera, and being able to live in and understand something that, in this case, is taking a grid and essentially turning it on its side and making the in-between. So these are two conditions I think that I want to have latent in the talk. The other one, and this gets into kind of issues of political economy, which are obviously relevant today, but where does architecture stack up anyway in the field of everything? And while we study and think about it as a discipline, there's disciplines to fashion design, there's disciplines to industrial design, architecture, even to the production and design of nature itself. And we know that there can be a tremendous level of self-similarity about the idea of design. But architecture, in many ways, I put it, that's a project of Ito in Barcelona. It's just one thing. It's just one medium. And especially thinking about it in terms of the field of media and in relation to everyday life technology, architecture, it's not simply a question of, I'm not portraying it as being vulnerable or having slipped as a form of status in the world. It's just that because it's the biggest and most outrageous kind of form of production in and of itself, and that everything's a one-off in relation to the world of repetition and so forth, it just means that we have to continually think about the status of the work and its value, let's say, in our landscape. So I'm going to use HL23 to just go through these 4 basic value systems, and if you know anything about Baudrillard or Marx, and just understanding how everything gets co-opted into a system, let's just analyze it very quickly. So we know this building is a condominium for 12 wealthy people. That's its function, to house them theoretically. These shots are kind of interesting. There's no furniture. We weren't allowed to shoot anything. So it's not yet occupied. It's there as a kind of piece of real estate meat, so to speak. Now, I'll let all of those kinds of terms linger in the air, both as being optimistic and kind of critical and deadpan and very realist at the same time. It's also, like everything else, an element in an exchange system. Exchange systems exist in many, many forms. The most traditional one, of course, is an object in a marketplace that has a monetary value. Building costs a certain amount. Developer writes a pro forma. Everything becomes related to the system around it. Now, you have to remember that this building may not, in many ways, this particular building might not be able to exist today, but it certainly existed in its origin in 2005 when we got the commission, which was an incredible boom. Russian oligarchs and Brazilian billionaires and et cetera were obviously investing in a place like New York, and they were the ones who were underwriting essentially what became a project for an architect to do something that would have some other sort of value. Of course, as architects, we're not involved in the exchange system. Yes, we have fees and so forth, but we don't see anything in terms of the real raw exchange value. We engage in it in another way. There's the idea of the symbolic value, or something that's akin to the gift system. Symbolic, which is it doesn't have any other function but accrue a level of value like a diamond ring. You don't use a diamond ring other than for portraying a story behind it. It's weird, you get a commission. Our client says, you should do something unusual, you should do something iconic, you should do something you. And that's the first moment in which you sort of struggle with the idea of saying, okay, we'll do our best work, we'll leave it in the city, but what symbolic value is it in the city if it's, in this case, a condominium for wealthy people? It's not a city hall, it's not a library, it's not a theater. And that's where you start driving the line between cultural projects, which of course we know they're also subsidized by market-driven concerns, not overtly, versus a project which is being underwritten by profit. So theoretically, it's not at all possible that this building would have any symbolic value because it's not a public building, but we persisted when we were designing it and saying, well, we're going to do this project. We've been asked to misbehave, so to speak, in the context of the city. We can only, without pretense, say, well, it's a gift to the city. But that's a pretty strange thought for this type of building to say, well, we'll give this to you as if it was a meaningful project. And having talked to a lot of people while on the High Line, but actually I did it surreptitiously. Didn't stand there on the High Line telling people I was the architect. I actually interviewed them and said, what do you think about this building? I was deeply curious. And for every person who said, I think it's beautiful, the next said it's the worst building, the most ugly project I've ever seen, almost like what happened in the election, sort of falling on party lines. And one wonders what the political identity of all of these people were. But for half the people, this is an eyesore. This is not anything about the symbolic project of a gift to the city. The last one, of course, is the sign value, and there are always, let's say in this particular building, there's 3 owners to the building. One is the developer. Developer said, that's my building. 11 owners say, that's my building, and the architect gets to walk out and go, that's my building. So we all share in this ownership, and in ownership, it's a funny term to co-opt in relation to, let's say, authorship. Novelist says, that's my book. I'm not the author of the book, that's my book, I own it. And in some respects, these projects do represent a sign of what's going on. So by the time we get past functionality, we get past symbol, we get past exchange, then the only thing here is this is a sign of the problem of the grid, which I referred to in the city. This building is supposed to be, based on as-of-right zoning, the same as this building, 25 feet wide. It would have been a replica, it would have stepped back and so forth. So our client gave us this challenge, can you do a bigger project, figure out a way to make it not seem as though I'm an egregious developer. And in fact, the premise was, while it's a piece of real estate, the idea was the site would demand something of some sort of special quality. So that's at the moment where we took it on as almost like a public building. So by our force, we imagine there to be some symbolic value to the project. To make it move away from the grid, we did small things like we built the project with no spandrel panel so that the number of horizontal lines would be reduced. Of course, we infused the diagram of the structure on it. It's also getting bigger as it goes up, which is, as the structure is a diagram of the way in which the building works, this is also a diagram of not only transgression into public space, but it's a diagram of trying to make the units at the top of the building bigger because it slopes back and it comes out. So there's implicit organizational ideas, especially in conversation with the client. I just want to point this out because I'm going to show a couple of towers. This is Knockageen Tower, 1972, as you know. Trellick by Goldfinger, also 1972. This is erected. It launches. It's the future. Not only for Tokyo, but for metabolist architecture, for a city that would imagine itself to continue its economic miracle in terms of the development of technology. And by the time this was finished, it was dead on arrival. It was hated. No one wanted to live in it. It was brutal in all aspects of the term. I made this little graph. Here's Knockageen. Futurism still holds. And at a certain point, it kind of peaks out because real estate in Tokyo starts to become even more insane. Well, meanwhile, this thing starts out stillborn with no life. Trellick manages to avoid total scorn and ridicule, and at a certain point, these two buildings cross, both in terms of being beloved, but also in terms of real value. This building will probably get torn down one day, and this one can't because it's now a listed building. The one that started out with no value, no life. This is an example of obviously public opinion, of typology, that on the one hand, given time, given its place and all of that, you can assign sort of incriminating aspects to the typology. Let's say J.G. Ballard certainly did, because Trellick was the inspiration for his novel. I want to show you two projects in Vancouver, both towers, both for the marketplace. Both questions about how to conduct an experiment within incredible limits, and we kind of put that out in the world in terms of the context of value. The first one is more or less in the downtown core. This is a zone of 100-meter towers. That's pretty much the natural zoning. And the next one is in a lower rise world across False Creek. There are 2 of 4 towers that we're doing in Vancouver for one developer. The tallest is 55 stories. Now, if you've ever been there, it's a beautiful city, not strictly because of this, but because of the incredible topography, the mountain range, the snow, the peaks, and so forth. And from 1980, the city has sort of grown up with an image of the idea of Hong Kong or New York. On the one hand, below there are podiums for parking, so it truly is still a drive-in, drive-out city. It's walkable, it's green, et cetera. It doesn't completely defy the kind of marketing rhetoric. But you see, each one of these projects is nothing more, as we know, than a matrix of numbers and of window wall systems, and I call these snowflakes all the same, yet so microscopically different, where somehow the architects are not willing to adjust the project to the grid or figuring out a way to, let's say, undermine it or get around it. Here's our site. It's part of a larger project of 4 buildings on the site. This is the smallest of 3 towers in a row, and there's a bit of a story on all of these projects. This is a project, the first scheme, and this scheme, like the project in New York, especially after we were able to construct HL23, this is a scheme in which we were asked to also push back on zoning. We asked for 8 waivers on HL23. One was a straw man waiver. We gave one up, got the rest of them. It's too wide, it's too tall. It goes into public space. It wasn't over the FAR. This one is double the rezoning. It also pushed back on a 60-foot distance between this tower. This is 80 feet. And we went through the process. Zoning dictates a certain amount of this, and a view cone corridor. There are 12 view cones that pass over Vancouver from various points. They're static, but if you're at a certain point, then no building mass will be able to be built in that view cone. This is the Two Lions view cone, which is Twin Peaks, that if you are up on the top of the city, on the other side of the water, you'd see those peaks. So this project kind of gets out in the way of that. And it's a product of a game and a negotiation, not only in terms of the form, which, by the way, when you look at it, is it cries out, don't ask me to be a tower. Don't ask me to be beautiful. Don't ask me to be elegant. Don't ask me to be slim or have a top or anything. Just let me sort of exist and do whatever I need to do, and especially in kind of quirky views, understand the project as being what it is. Now, we were able to, amidst a grid, a black grid, which says everything about the program. These are all micro apartment units. They're 320 square feet. They're fully built out. The entire building is a Swiss Army knife of pixels and units. We were able to find numbers that allowed us to take out units and work these exterior voids in, which of course are super clear in their contrast. This particular view, you can see there's a diagonal strut, which is on only visible in this glazing slot, but for which this embossed skin hides otherwise. And here's the inspiration for the project, an obsession that has been, for a while now, really affecting the work. And this is almost an isomorphic one-to-one project, not only in being able to take the grid of Mies, the militant Mies, the moral Mies, the black painted steel Mies, and take the, let's say, arranged marriage, high contrast project, not only in terms of color, but also in terms of form, and the uniform nature of them. They're all steel. They're just painted steel. My steel project is a straight grid and painted black, and my steel project is just as beautifully engineered as your project. And I don't know if the person who put these projects together, there are 3 or 4 of them in the world, were so curatorially aware as I am, but that's what I'm finding in this relationship. But this is the ultimate merger between the two in 1968. And Hernan mentioned the word control, and that's a lot of what I want to get across tonight, is the degree to which discipline and a certain level of control and incredible resistance still finds the erotic, I would say. And what is understood as being machinic and ordered versus having vitality and life, both of those things are at work regardless of what color it is, what form it is, et cetera. But it got rejected. Unlike New York, it wasn't a moment in time in which city planning would bend the rules for a legacy project like the High Line. Doesn't exist. This is one building on a corner. So 3 years went through, and we weren't able to do the project. So we had to start over. And I'm going to show you the project that's a by right project. So what's curious about this story is, and I have to be quite honest, after finishing HL23, very expensive building, you know, $1,000 a foot, which, by the way, made the most amount of money in West Chelsea in the $3.5 billion of construction, made the most amount of money per square foot published out there, for which, again, that just talks about the exchange value. It also inhibited people from hiring us. You only do the $1,000 a foot projects, right? You don't do the cheaper projects. That's not who you are. It was a weird thing to kind of live down a project that you would think would sort of set the bar for everything that you do, but it was a bit of a problem, besides the fact that if you would do a project like that, you'd hire Tom or a Pritzker Prize winner and not somebody of my level. So we had to be able to rethink the way in which we could do architecture in a system that was much, much more, quote unquote, normal. I know you don't like these kinds of diagrams. I put them in because you don't like them. And you're going to have to look at 3 or 4 of them, so just deal with it. And I'm happy to talk about having you find and understand the relationship between urban projects, which aren't unfettered, and this is almost saying they're not all like the project we did in New York, that there's a system at work. This is the big deal right here. This particular chamfer is driven by the sun, and the view cone, so this is a diagonal slot, and this is a horizontal slot, which runs directly across as it did in the first project. So the top of the building at this particular point is not designed by us. I didn't walk in with a sketch nervously saying, I see a top and it's going to look like this. That's not what happens. And so we just make one giant move, which is to reciprocate and push back on the normative nature of the grid here and problematize the building, both in terms of geometry. No, not problematize the geometry, problematize the interiors for the sake of making a project become a project, let's say, fits the mission of what the client is interested in, which is, we're tired of all the snowflakes in the city, and we're calling you in because of your skill to be able to make a snowflake, I guess, deep down underneath, because those are the metrics of the project, and then find another route to be able to investigate it. So I show you the massing development. So number one, the nature of the top of the project, the shaft and the base, all become incredibly clear agendas for the project. And you can see the way in which buildings come down to the ground, and many of the new projects, like ours, have a big podium for which then you have to step back from. And I'll explain the interrogation into that. Like the black and red project, this one isn't at all, especially when you look at it on the oblique and it widens out, which is the way in which you'd see the project anyway. We see a relatively hardcore project with a very, very tight plan, and then ways in which the base and the top are somehow morphed together to be able to, let's say, make a project which is, on the one hand, not elegant nor inelegant. It's odd in the sense that the top screams out, "I am a tower," whereas the red and black one did not. But this one also still doesn't ask the question to be, I would say, exquisite at some particular level. In Texas, where I grew up, these two towers came to mind when we were forced, as it were, to deal with the chamfered top. Of course, there are other towers. And while Philip Johnson was not ever the architect that Harry Cobb is still today, Pennzoil Place is Johnson's best building, I would say, where all he was doing was trying to kill Mies, leaving Mies's body sort of intact here, and then working in a kind of Barnett Newman minimalism to make a project that still has incredible qualities today. And Harry making a project during the height of postmodernism, an architect who was, as you saw in his lecture, deeply influenced by history, making a project still that, in this particular image, of course, evokes some aspects of Historis's profile, but this is a brilliant building as it spirals around. In both cases, the base, the shaft, and the top being the problem. Very simple project. Of course, it's a split between a office core, here's a residential core, and retail. And except for this backside on a small lane, the rest of this building actually doesn't touch the ground. So it's a very tall, giant project which refuses to touch the ground, which is also perhaps kind of curious and problematic. And the issue of shifting the grid, which I understand is a bit of a trope, is still involved in one minor way to try to deal with the problem of the grid. What we're also doing is smuggling in other programs. This is an office building that actually fills out the deep part of the base in a party wall. It doesn't change its form or its fenestration except right here where there's a large window, totally arbitrary device. And that device is simply designed to produce a silhouette for the project which erodes the base as much as possible to get around the problem of the podium and the shaft and the top. However it works, that's the ambition for it. In the middle of the building, this is what it is. We've become experts at efficiency in this level, and here's where the building starts to slope and splay, where previous we've got 320-foot units which can't be disturbed in any possible way, to 2- and 3-bedroom units where we can use odd shapes for the loose fit of furniture and so forth. So there's nothing new here except that in many respects the problem of the grid and dealing with the grid is still, to me, an opportunity. The core actually shifts, the stair core shifts from one side of the building to the other as it goes up, and there's an internal transfer stair and up to the very, very small parts of the building. The second one is in a territory of no high-rises. This is the Vancouver City Hall, looking kind of ominously, imperiously up the hill across our site. This is a major thoroughfare. It's going to have a subway built over the next 10 years that connects the east side all the way out to the University of British Columbia. There's an Arcadian neighborhood in the back and commercial in front. And our ask was to do a twin tower project, but a very, very simple project for rental units. And the idea is to connect the lane in the back, which is higher, 25 feet higher than the main street, with a public park and two towers in between. So we're already, again, dealing with, let's say, the tower and the park problem, and trying to attack that problem, let's say, head on, just the same way we were doing it with the podium and the tower in downtown. This will be a dormitory for Emily Carr College. It's the best art school in Canada. And this is a market rate rental housing for 1, 2, and 3 bedroom, more or less the family tower. And all we've done, and this is also a straight convention, is where we disturb the grid. These are study rooms that are dispersed around the dormitory, and these are two-story spaces for gym and ancillary spaces and also spaces up here. So this is just like the diagram of the structure in HL 23, which is, here's the normative part, here's the part that you can't disturb, and here's the diagram for what you can, because otherwise these are the projects. And the conditions of doing these projects, of course, I don't talk about them to be banal or to browbeat or to say it's finally come for us to be able to confront all of this. I don't use this because none of these things are excuses. In fact, these are incredible drivers for projects. So a developer will put on one pair of glasses, obviously, and look at 95% efficiency, and in the very moment, put the glasses back on as if that didn't matter, because there's the issue of sign value, there's the issue of legacy value, and at that moment, there is something that's shared quite deeply with the architect, because we don't participate, again, in the nature of exchange at that level. So these are pretty straightforward concrete struts that allow this kind of torquing and cantilevering to happen on the corner, which we'd already investigated structurally on the red and black project. Okay, so those towers were under certain conditions, and I'm going to show you 3 projects which are not developer projects, but to me, the best thing I can say is that they operate under the same ethos. They have the same ambition to make a kind of project that would invoke some of the issues of legibility, immediacy, the nature of the graphic, of which all of the projects I just showed do as well. This is El Paso, Texas. This is the gateway to the west and the gateway to the chaotic south. This is, you can see the grain change between Juarez and El Paso, about 1 million people. It's the most out-of-the-way place that only takes 90 minutes on the plane to get to, and I find it for that reason incredibly fascinating. And we were asked to make a building on top of a 3-story brick warehouse, which has been renovated by the owner into an office building. And we're standing on a ramp, a street that's leading down from a new baseball stadium, 3 years old, AAA baseball stadium, which has really become the centerpiece in the city. You can see the mountains of the Juarez Desert and Juarez sprawling out. This is about 300 meters from the border. You could assign a lot of politics to a project like this, given what we know today. But in this particular case, the project is meant to be a project that actually takes on some aspects of the issue of the value system that I just talked about. This is a 10,000 square foot office addition for TransTelco, which is a telecommunications company. They lay cable in all the way to Monterey in the west and down through Mexico in the south, and they're nowhere near Telmex or Carlos Slim's world. They have about 5% of the market, but they're growing, and of course it's a incredible venture. So they're in a position to make this project, but it's also a family, multi-generational family, Mexican-American family, and they've been in El Paso their whole life. So we were given this commission not only to satisfy the function of the 10,000 square feet of office space and some cultural space, but also to give it as a gift to the city, to challenge architecture in the future in a city that really has none. So whether this is the equivalent of a diamond ring to the city or not, our client understands it, and their ambition is to see it that way. Half the people may hate it, just like HL 23. But let's face it, you don't obviously take a poll before you put your project out there. You put it out there and you do it. Now, architecturally, and I showed a couple of images, and I remember John Enright and I think also Kipnis going, why does it just sit right on top of the building? Why does it just do that? And I find it to be, that's the project we wanted to make, which is the most irreal aspect of how you'd lay a building on the corner of a site, just like an iPhone on the corner of a table. We didn't want anything to intervene visually between that. We wanted that to be the most shocking aspect of it, not just that it would have landed, so to speak, but that there was no capacity for it to land because you don't see any feet, you don't see any legs. It's not like the Farnsworth house in the landscape. So it's the most irreal relationship we could have. Our client asked us to cantilever the project toward this corner. This is the main view of downtown and so forth, and you saw also from the context shot, it would become an erstwhile gateway or marker, and it was eerily very, very similar in that sense to HL 23. There's the soffit, which brings color from people like Barragán and the world of Mexico, a place where there's so much color, into a city that is really nearly barren. And that is projected into public space. And aside, the city architect in El Paso is a lady named Laura Foster. She graduated from SCI-Arc in 1992, and she was my student twice at SCI-Arc. Once we went to Japan, and I showed up and I said, "Can we cantilever this in public space?" She said, "Just sure, whatever you want to do." It's a little bit make it up as you go along in certain places, and this is surely one of them. There's still hoops to jump over, but our client has to lease this soffit for, I think, $1,000 a year for as long as the building is there. Now, the project is meant to look like a relatively tight, autonomous, controlled near piece of industrial design. Number one, for the idea of a kind of scale shift, both a project that has scale, but scalelessness to it, especially when you look at this loggia, which is a east-facing screen, which deals in sun control. This is the north face, where we've tweaked the building, where there's no direct sunlight on the building, therefore we won't have any shades. It'll just be a complete lantern during the day. The project is both strictly related to the environment. This is the south facade, one window constantly shaded in solar design 101, deep windows here, a screen on the west, et cetera. So it's completely set up to be both the idea of an alien thing, but not so alien, let's say, like Wolf's rooftop project in Vienna. This has references probably to the world around us in terms of product design. 30 people work in here. This is the father of the two sons who developed the company. He's got his world. Their cousins work in here. They're cattle traders, which seems very appropriate for Texas. I didn't know that you still traded cattle, but it's a big thing. And this is a I'm a Texan, I'm allowed to say stuff like that. And this is an art gallery that will be used as a public space. It's otherwise the lobby for the project. This is the existing elevator shaft, so we're wrapping the building around the existing elevator shaft. And this is where the last stop on the elevator is. Otherwise, we lift the building up inside into an internal landscape. We've forced the project into just a very pure wafer of space. No need to modify the roof geometry because you're looking up at the building most of the time. And already the profile of the building does its work in terms of how the eye would perceive the project. And otherwise, this is very much a modulated world in terms of light and interior environment. This project is a curious one. This was on, we did last summer on the campus of Caltech in Pasadena. It's a very beautiful campus, many historic buildings. This is the Cahill Laboratory by Morphosis, and it represents, I think, it's slightly off the campus, as you see. Tom, they wouldn't let you do one right in the middle, I guess. So we were given a site right here, which is fairly close to the heart of the campus, to do an innovations center. And I have to kind of contextualize the project a little bit. This project was a counter-proposal, and here's where conditions are kind of curious. There was another project being proposed, and that had been temporarily accepted by the provost and the president. And the donor and other people engaged with the university asked our office to design a project which could put that one aside. So it was on one hand a kind of speculative project, not a competition, something very much directed toward the site and the program. And because of those special conditions, we did two versions of the same project, and I'm going to tell you why we did that. We developed one plan that was very specifically tailored to the condition of the site, existing trees, existing pathways, an ambiguous limit to the site, a cafe, which is a very important node, a thoroughfare on the east side of the building that should be respected. So the plan develops as a kind of an ergonomic, very much hand-in-glove site project. The program essentially is a one-story building with an atrium, and it masquerades as an innovation center. It could be also seen simply as a student center, a place to talk, a place to engage in ideas, maybe build a robot, and come together. There's only 900 undergraduates on the campus. What I'm going to show you first is the context typology scheme. And what we thought was, and this is a curious kind of strategy, we thought, well, the scheme in terms of how it fits on the site is there. We're going to do two versions of the project for two reasons. Number one, to try to get the job and go 2 for 1. Number two, to actually articulate for ourselves a bandwidth of, let's say, formal ideas and material ideas that we felt incredibly strong about. So the first one is a poured-in-place concrete building, and it's the project which articulates history at the level of the arcade, obviously of the masonry building. These are all mostly a mix of Spanish buildings, you know, of all periods. The one that's on this particular site now is a Spanish revival from 1960, which would be torn down to make this project. The brief also said it should be a glass building as a transparent space so that there was connectivity all the way through the project, and that it should more or less operate as a pavilion. So if you say it has 4 sides, there's entries on 4 sides. At the apex of one of the sides, there's a cafe. Because it's incredibly hot in Pasadena, we decided to push the project 3.5 feet down and obviously deal with the idea of a roof rather than making a screen that would screen out the visibility of the project. So it became a very basic project in a roof and a glass building and a certain amount of burrowing into the land. And in this particular case, a very clear typological idea of an arcade, which would relate to the arcades on the campus. And we were prepared very much to talk about this, as architects do relative to context, to talk about meaning and some aspects of performance. Now, this site doesn't have an arcade because it's got a different contextual condition. There's also taller buildings and trees which are going to shade the glass, whereas on the east and on the south, the project needs very, very deep shading, as it does here. This is the south facade, so it's a kind of a hypertrophic porch that we've developed to shade that amount of glass as the project then weaves around into the landscape. By the time we sort of move into the forest, the project just becomes a result of tweaking the plan in terms of very, very specific ergonomic conditions, cutting a corner around the building, but not actually going outside the building, but going between the building envelope and a column, and a series of punched windows that operate in deeper and more two-dimensional sort of fashion. Same plan, some tweaks. This is the subject matter project. And we presented two exactly in this way. Not to say that the first project wasn't accommodating of the program. It absolutely was accommodating in the program. But if the image of Caltech, and perhaps this is what Tom was thinking about to a certain extent when he did his project, which is Caltech is where JPL works and launching things into space. And despite the fact that it's a Mediterranean campus with olive groves all around, isn't the image of it architecturally something different than that? Isn't it something that sends messages of another sort? Well, we were able to kind of draw on the background of the metallic project and essentially make it the same, it's the same scheme underneath. And this was work that happened over 10 days in the office, and it was quite fun to argue that the formal language that we work with, shifting from material languages, shifting from different types of grids, and still dealing with the nature of schema as being the same, that's what makes design pretty fun, because we know that even if we have a scheme, we still don't know what the project is until we define it in terms of an argument and idea. And in this particular case, this is a building that's supposed to send messages about the subject matter. It's supposed to be isomorphic to what goes on inside. And we thought that covering these two bases, from the idea of a building that would theoretically fit in to one that would fit in terms of scheme, but would otherwise be sort of throwing elbows, at least in terms of the visual nature of it, would work. Still the same project, a glass building with a giant roof, in this case a different kind of screening mechanism for east glazing, and as you go around, the structure and the folded triangular grid just works in terms of partitioning, columns, stiffening, triangulating, et cetera. There's a big, big live oak tree, very, very huge live oak tree. And it was nice to kind of crumple the building, as it were, in a kind of a keto fashion to get out of the way of the tree, and having that particular device as a driver in the footprint and the geometry of the project, especially one which in its more origami fashion is really related to the specific condition, and there's the interior. The last project I'm going to show is a school on the west side. It entered the world the same year SCI-Arc did, 1971-72. It's a very liberal school, and it's located on a major boulevard. This is the Expo line in West L.A., and the site is here. And this is really a curious site when you look at it. It's not a site that you'd imagine, building a private school for 500 students, because it's such an arid, almost desert-like neo-industrial, neo-commercial world. Here's a tree and here's a tree, and then you can't see another tree in this entire world. So we thought of it as a curious kind of desert, beige stucco commercial buildings and so forth all around. Sorry for this. Building fits the footprint. It's a quirky footprint. It's not anything that you'd imagine LA generates. You imagine LA just generates kind of all big rectangular grids, but it's an oddball one. This isn't even a right angle. This is a few degrees off of a right angle. And the entire program fills the site. So we're already dealing with more or less a curious urban project, even though there's no party wall, nothing touches. And we've got zoning setbacks that essentially create the building stepping from the north to the south. And the deep plan project starts to take over where we need to perforate it. It could be a housing project. It could be a school, because we're dealing with some of the same, let's say, dimensional limits to the project. So to start off, of course, the color, which might be more of a color that the office has been associated with. I can show 10 projects. One would be green, and I would get a question, why are all your projects green? Just because of a kind of curious association with it. And of course, we wanted to assign a certain kind of optical value through the color in this kind of desert. It's a very primitive device on the one hand, but the elementary school for this school, which is not located and wouldn't be accommodated in this building, is in a nice, lush garden, and the current middle school has no outdoor amenities, no qualities, et cetera. I think I need to talk a little bit as a semiotician now, maybe as a critic, partly beyond the idea of how to accommodate a large program in a very, very confined site in a city that still begs to have iconicity and autonomy, and also for a client who said, we do want an icon, but we'd like for it to be really humble, because that's what our ethos is. We don't teach our students to go be the Wolf of Wall Street. We teach students to go help people. So what was curious about that was they didn't exactly say, you need to give up an agenda of vitality, because we still believe in that. And this is a conflation of the idea of a project on the one hand, which I think doesn't try to be too slick. It doesn't try to be overly beautiful. It tries to be itself in a way which I think is more quirky than exquisite in this particular case. This is a tough building to package. There's parking. The kids have to be dropped off inside the parking garage for safety, since it's an urban building. They can take the elevator or they can take the stair on the corner, but either way there's a security person there. Entering up into more or less the lobby from outside or from internal circulation, and you can see the big gym is an elephant of a room to have to accommodate in the site. So these big zones of programs start to self-organize themselves very, very simply. It's a modest project in many respects, and we're just simply trying to respect and track the way in which the program of the school would work, which is like a lot of schools, the kids are like water, and they sort of flow into every crevice, and every possible place can be used for any type of activity. So the stair is there as a kind of mediator or silent witness to the project. This is the east facade, where you can read the project as what I say is just an accumulation of an event, a series of events. As the mass of the project is already defined by the constraints of the project, where the terracing that fills out the site, then this line represents a deep setback, which happens to be related to the neighborhood behind. We actually have unlimited height, but we don't have unlimited program to put into the height, so we make little towers that push up into the beyond the profile of the project. Now, I think that what we learned on Keelung was what allowed us to make this particular project too, which was, while this site doesn't look like it was incredibly constrained, this was still the same thing, which was to deploy an office building on one part of the footprint, the terminal on another part of the footprint of the site, all which were very, very particular, and in this particular case, make a project which is woven together as both a number of pieces but also a whole. And that when you look at this whole ensemble of everything from, I wanted to put a tower in the project because the program didn't ask for a tower, so we force fit a tower into it, at least kind of on a local level. And everything that goes on in the project is tweaked and tailored to the site so that in the end, the building is nervous. It wants to behave in a certain way. I say it's nervous in the sense that it wants to fidget and twitch and be responsive at some deeply, deeply local level, and that's what this is. And I'd never thought about designing a project, small or large, at that particular level, and hope that we could find coherence within that project. And we return to some of those principles with this project. Laboratories and workrooms at the perimeter are kind of elastic, vague open space. This is the gym, of course, exterior space. And one void turns into two voids. And so instead of having a central void, we multiply the possible itineraries, as you see on the upper floors, and the public space around, as you see here. And the upper terrace is really a kind of cascading series of platforms that allow the students to be able to inhabit the project as if it were a kind of tectonic landscape, something that they have no resources to do at present. These are just some views of the way in which the void. There's one void that you see down there that's also tracking up through the building here. This void ends here, tracking down that way with lateral connections between them. Okay, you weren't going to get away without a music reference. That's what I do. That's what I like. And I want to return to the issue of discipline with these analogies. So Johnny Ramone didn't really know how to play the guitar very well. When the Ramones were founded, he had done some, pretty primitive playing in a band before. And so when he and the other guys sat down to say, well, let's start a band, they created an ideology, and if you know the Ramones, you know this story. They created an ideology which was, it was a band totally based on being a reactionary project. So progressive rock was going on at the time, bands like Yes and King Crimson and so forth, and there was so much virtuosity and skill in all of those bands, and symphonic layers and crescendos and ends and narratives and stories. And they got together and said, no solos and no longer than 2 minutes. It's a project, and we hate that, and so we're going to do this, and we're only going to learn what we need to do to carry out that manifesto. So in particular, Johnny said, not only will that happen, but I'm only going to use downstrokes. There's no strumming up and down, because if you strum up and down, it's a different type of feeling to the guitar. If you're only going to use downstrokes and still do 150 beats per minute, you're going to have to really master that technique. Really, really challenging to do that. But he said if you're going to be punk rock, there's no upstrokes in punk rock, only downstrokes. And so I'd argue, and besides 3 chords. You think discipline is, I'll learn everything and be really good and spend 10,000 hours, and then there's something else, which was they were incredibly ideologically disciplined, and he's the most disciplined guitarist there's ever been. Now, I'd argue that our architecture is like a 1 or 3 chord theory. We do something very simply, we do it really well, but we have an incredibly, incredibly reduced and limited repertoire. And I say that very openly because there's all sorts of tools and temptations to do more. And for a long time, I've sort of felt maybe because I was really under the impression that, well, I'd have the skill to, with my team, pull off anything we wanted, that we'd have to employ a certain level of control and discipline. So whether it's in the realm of a volume or a surface, we only use 1 or 2 or 3 chords, just like the Ramones. Now, what's the opposite is, he was working very hard to make something look simple, and we're doing something simple to make it look more than what it really is. There's a little bit of a let's say what I call a high economy project. It's not an easy project. It's not laissez-faire. It's just that we've limited ourselves very, very strictly to the way in which you could put something together. Now, in the same year in Dusseldorf, Kraftwerk don't have guitars. They have analog synthesizers like Moogs and ARPs. And after shedding their hippie image like all krautrock bands, they decided to go all in on the robot project and send messages that way. And you would think, though, also that they had the same sort of discipline after they said, we're not going to do the hippie project, we're going to put our flutes away. They did have guitars and stuff, and they put it all away, and they said, we're going to invest everything we have in this machine, and we're going to get everything out of it. And for the most part, they produced a kind of music that a lot of people like, a lot of people don't like. I like both of these bands because they're super repetitious and very, very hardcore in their way of thinking. Now, this is my synthesizer that I spend whatever free time I have with right now, and this is an analogy for the grid, because it really is a grid. Each one of these pieces fits into an international system. There's probably 2,500 of these so-called modules that are being produced now that you can buy them all, or 3 or 4, and put them together in a context where they can all affect one another. So this is like a city. Number one, it agrees to the discipline of the grid. Number two, there's a way in which you set up your grid to allow certain relationships, but then they're overcoated with this kind of wiring. So you've got oscillators and low-pass filters and ring modulators and texturizers and wave shapers, et cetera, and clock dividers, and you put all of this stuff together to modify the sound, but you're just modifying the grid. So Kraftwerk just took the grid and modified it in that way. And here's the diagram I want to leave you with, because this is now, in being involved in music, even just as a serious hobbyist for all this time, I always said it doesn't have anything to do with how I think or how we work. So here's the symbol of rock and roll, but in the case of, let's say, Johnny Ramone, he posed as a rock and roll guitarist, but he was a punk rock guitarist. He wasn't flamboyant in his playing. He was reduced and very hardcore. But let's say there's some part of this which is wild, but within this wild thing, there's still discipline, and you can go through various other filters to modify that wildness before you even get to the grid. So this is our controller, and this is the sort of first order of who we are and what we do. And in the projects now, the synthesizer as a grid is really an analogous form to the city and to the market and to the project. So we're sending signals, we're sending ideological biases, we're sending theoretical biases through this first part of the system into the grid, and we're still operating, let's say, on the technology of the grid, and what we hope comes out on the end is something special, something of some great effect, but that still puts probably, especially in terms of music, distinctly different agendas, images, and ideas, that there's really a lot of soul in the issue of discipline, and control is not rigid. Control still has wildness in it. And we just try to understand how to make that work, and I just want to leave you with this diagram. Thanks a lot.